All right, so the last section of Unit 1 is finding the midpoint of a segment. And really, the midpoint of a segment is similar to finding the average of two tests. So just think about finding the midpoint of a segment, similar to finding the average of two test scores or the average of really any two items. You're just taking the average of the coordinates of the two endpoints. So average is the sum of the two endpoints, or the sum of any two items divided by 2. So if we wanted to find the point right in the middle of QR, you can just take your two endpoints, -3 and 4, or the coordinates of the two endpoints, add them together, and divide by 2, just like you're finding average. And we get 1/2. If you go to your number line and plot 1/2, positive 1/2, you can see we are the same distance to R as we are to Q. Remember, when I'm putting one line or two lines on both, it's showing same distance, congruent. All right, let's find the midpoint of a couple other segments. Let's do A and C. Midpoint of EF. Sometimes you can just count in 1, 1, 1, 1, and that might be easier, and see that your midpoint is -1, or the coordinate of the midpoint. Other times it might be easier to just find the average like we were doing before. So 75 plus 60 divided by 2. It's going to be right in the middle of 65 and 70. Let's see, 135 divided by 2. It's okay if we get in a decimal, 67, or a fraction, 0.5. Okay, why don't you try example B? The midpoint between GH would be 47.5. And then for example D, -1 plus 4 divided by 2 gets us 3/2, which is the same. You can leave it as 3/2 or write it as a decimal, 1.5. 1.5 is right here, the same distance to T as it is to S. Great. Okay, moving on to our coordinate plane. Just like length, our midpoint formula changes slightly when we're finding the midpoint on a coordinate plane, because now we have two axes. We have the horizontal axis, our x-axis, and the vertical axis, our y-axis. The location of a point on our coordinate plane, it's given by an ordered pair, an xy ordered pair. So when we're finding the midpoint of a segment on the coordinate plane, you need to find the average twice. You need to find the average of the x coordinates and the average of the y coordinates, which is why you really see your midpoint formula twice here. So let's try this example together. Let's first label the coordinates of our endpoints. This is +5, +3 for our y, -4, -1 for our y coordinate. Find the average of your x's, find the average of your y's. So for our x's, that would be 5 and -4 divided by 2. And then for our y's, -1 plus 3 divided by 2. We get +1/2 and 2/2, which can simplify to 1. Let's go plot that point and make sure it looks like it's right in the middle of this segment. +1/2, remember the 1/2 is our x, so the +1/2 would be right here in between 0 and 1 on our x. And then +1 on our y would be right here. And it looks like that's meeting right at the middle of this segment, so we can label that M as our midpoint and show that these two segments are congruent. All right, let's practice a few others. Let's try example A together, and then C, where you're given 2 points without a coordinate plane, and then you'll try 2 on your own. For A, if it's just back to a horizontal line, we don't really need to label our endpoints. We can just look at the x's. This is at -4, and this endpoint is at +2. If we just find the average of the two x coordinates, we get -2/2, which is -1. Here's our -1. We know that it needs to be at the same y coordinate because it's a horizontal line. So our midpoint would be at -1, +2. Okay. Let's try another for C without graphing this point. The x's would be 11 and -3. 11 plus a -3 divided by 2, and -10 plus 9 divided by 2. We get 8/2, -1/2, and then let's simplify that 8/2 to 4, -1/2 as the coordinates of our midpoint. All right, why don't you guys try B, D, and F. And we'll put the solutions up when you are done. For B, your midpoint would have been located at 0, -1. Plot that point, make sure it looks like it's right in the middle of these two endpoints. Yep, these two segments are congruent. It looks like it's right in the middle. For D, your midpoint was located at -3.5 and 5.5. Right, the average of your x's, 2 plus a -9 is -7, and then 11 plus 0 is just 11 divided by 2 gets you your 5.5. And last but not least, for F, the average of your x's, 5 plus a -1 gets you 4/2, which simplifies to 2, and then 9 and 9 gets you 18. Half of 18 would be 9. So this was another horizontal line where the y coordinates were going to be exactly the same, kind of like this example up here, or just like the example we did up above for A. Okay, the last thing you might be asked to do is you might be given the midpoint, and you might be asked to find one of the endpoints. So let's do that on this example. You are given S and R. Let's label both. So S is at -1, 1, and R is at -6, -1. And we're told that S is the midpoint. So if S is the midpoint, that means T is located somewhere over here. And the way we're going to find where T is located is we can really just use the slope of this line and go the same direction. So if we went up 2, then from S we need to go up 2 again. Then we would go to the right 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We need to go to the right 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more times. And now we have our coordinates for T, which should be located at +4, +3. If you wanted to check to make sure your coordinates were correct, R is at -6, -1. Just work your averages. -6 plus +4 would be -2 divided by 2 gets you -1. And then a -1 and +3 for your y's gets you 2/2, which is +1. Okay, why don't you try, let's try A together, and then you can finish up with B. These are a little tricky when you don't have a graph. I'm just going to show you by writing your equation. For A, remember our midpoint, if we look at the x-coordinate, 2 came from the average of two endpoints, so -3, and then some other x-coordinate that we divided by 2. And then for our y, 7 came from the average of this y-coordinate for A, 5, and some other y coordinate divided by 2. And these are just two equations we can solve, right? Multiply both sides by 2. We get 4 equals negative 3 plus x. X equals 7. Multiply both sides by 2. 14 equals 5 plus y. When you subtract your 5 over, we get 9. Our midpoint is at 7, 9. So try whichever method you'd like. If you want to use your midpoint formula, just come back onto this previous page. We were just using that midpoint formula with x equals and y equals. Okay, x and y are the coordinates of your midpoint. Or you can go ahead and plot a coordinate plane on here to find the coordinates of n. Okay, try B on your own. If you were using this same formula we did for A, you would have had negative 1 equals this 5 plus x divided by 2, and then 4 equals 7 plus some y coordinate divided by 2. We get 8 equals 7 plus y, so a y coordinate of 1. Negative 2 equals 5 plus x, so an x coordinate of negative 7. Your midpoint was at negative 7, positive 1. Okay. If you need to go ahead and put a graph on here, you can find any of these graphs on Google. Just search coordinate plane and then copy and paste one into your notes or your homework and solve that way. I'll show you some of those examples when we're going over the homework together. All right, good luck, and I'll answer any questions you have in class.